Sometimes the uniform they mock is the one that will save them. It started in the parking lot, my boots clicking against blacktop still wet with morning dew. My fingers trembled just enough to betray me as I adjusted the bars on my shoulder. I stared at the rearview mirror for a long time. The reflection didn't blink back. Maybe I'd already left her behind, the girl they used to call Ellie, the one who used to stand just outside the family frame. You know that feeling, don't you? When you arrive, but the air tells you you're not welcome, like the oxygen was exhaled by someone who already decided you shouldn't exist. I stepped out anyway. My posture straightened by something deeper than duty, the kind of spine you develop not from training, but from being dismissed long enough to forge your own rank. The funeral was at St. Luke's, the church that baptized every Owens child but seemed to forget one. He was the patriarch, my grandfather, General Thomas Owens, a man carved in marble, buried in protocol, and even now, lying in a flag-draped casket, he held power I wasn't supposed to touch. Aunt Lila saw me first. Her eyes scanned from my cap to my creased trousers to the medals glinting like defiance on my chest. She didn't smile, just turned her head and muttered loud enough for the cousins to hear. Oh, look. She wore the costume. The air shifted. I could hear snickers, quiet ones, polished by lipstick and pearl earrings. I walked past them anyway, each step echoing louder than their judgment. Inside, the scent of pine polish and incense wrapped around the pews like a memory. I stood in the aisle, watching as every row filled, and not one head turned. I wasn't expected. I wasn't wanted. But I was summoned. Not by them, by something deeper. I sat alone, 2 rows from the front, beside an empty space that might have been saved for someone else. Or maybe it was the seat where I was supposed to remain invisible. A shadow. The ceremony began. My uncle gave the eulogy. My brother, Mark, read the psalm. And my mother, she wept. Loudly, as though her sorrow gave her ownership of him, as though she had never once said to me, "Don't bring your work around here. This is a family gathering." You know that sting, don't you? When love is weaponized to shrink you, when your success becomes something they endure, not celebrate. The chaplain spoke of honor, of duty, of leadership, and I listened, wondering if any of them realized those words matched the ones etched into my own service files. Only they weren't read out loud in stained glass rooms. They were classified, buried behind cipher locks and clearance codes. No one clapped when I returned from deployment. No one visited when I got out of Walter Reed. But here, at the funeral of a man who once told me women belonged in the reception corps, they gathered like he was Olympus. I didn't cry. I couldn't. Not because I didn't love him, though our love was a cold one, but because I knew what he did before he died. He summoned me. 2 weeks earlier, an envelope arrived, unmarked. Inside was a single line in his handwriting. Be in uniform. That was all. No date. No apology. No explanation. Just an order from a man who once dismissed me in front of a room full of brass. But I obeyed. Not for him. For me. When the ceremony ended, people moved in waves, hugging and whispering and remembering the general the way they wanted to. I stayed seated, still, a stone in the current. Then someone approached the podium, a man in a dark suit, holding a black folder. My name is Colonel Mercer. I've been asked to read a final directive from General Thomas Owens, dictated in the last weeks of his life. Chatter died instantly. He opened the folder. To those gathered here today, this is not a legal matter. The will shall be executed separately. This is a personal command. I felt my spine tighten. He continued, There is one person whose presence here today will likely cause discomfort to many of you. That discomfort is your burden, not hers. A tremor went through the room. My mother shifted. My brother clenched his jaw. I, General Owens, do hereby acknowledge Major Eleanor Owens, United States Army Intelligence, as the rightful bearer of my legacy in leadership, honor, and courage. Gasps rippled. She will carry my medals. She will hold my burial flag. She will receive my sword. My heart did not race. It slowed. And to those of you who questioned her inclusion, understand this. It is not blood that earns respect. It is valor. He closed the folder. Silence fell like a command from above. And suddenly, everyone turned. They looked at me, not the girl who skipped family brunches, not the daughter who worked too much, not the career woman who never wore dresses. They looked at the woman in uniform, the one whose name was carved into orders they could never see. And still, none of them spoke. So I stood, calmly, deliberately. I walked forward, each step a memory of every time they left me off the family email, every time they forgot my birthday, every time they joked that I was probably somewhere running drills. I approached the altar. The flag was folded perfectly. A young cadet stood holding it. He turned to me. "Major Owens," he said, voice steady, and I, finally, reached out, not just for the flag, but for everything they tried to deny me. You ever felt that moment when silence becomes power, when you don't need to argue anymore because reality has already spoken? I turned around, the flag in my arms. I passed each row. I met every eye. Not one person laughed. Not anymore. I walked out of that church not to leave them behind, but because they'd already done that to me years ago. Long before the salute, long before the funeral, long before the folder with my name inked into a dead man's final breath. I stepped out into the light and the glare hit the gold insignia on my shoulder like a spotlight. One aunt raised her hand to her forehead to shield her eyes, as if she couldn't bear to see it. The irony made me want to laugh how hard they squint when the truth shines too bright. The flag was heavy, heavier than it looked. Not in weight, in what it carried. Decades of silence folded into perfect corners. I held it to my chest, and my fingertips brushed the edge. That's when the memories began to press forward like old ghosts. The time I wore my JROTC pin to my cousin's graduation, and someone asked if I was playing dress-up. The day I got accepted to West Point and no one in my family called. The moment I was promoted to major alone in a quiet base, to the applause of men who saw me but didn't know me. And now, suddenly, my name was gospel. Spoken from a podium, declared to a bloodline that once erased it from holiday place cards. You know what it's like? Right. To be tolerated in public and deleted in private. To feel the eyes of people who only recognize your worth when someone powerful says your name. A car door slammed behind me. I turned. My brother, Mark, stood there. He'd removed his tie. His eyes were bloodshot. Not from grief. From something deeper rage. Shame. He didn't move toward me. Just stared. "You think this changes anything?" he asked. I didn't answer. Because I knew he didn't want one. He wanted the old hierarchy back. Where I was, the mistake. The afterthought. The girl who left and never looked back. But I did look back. Every time I stepped into a debriefing room with no windows. Every time I signed off on intel reports that bore the weight of life and death. Every time I heard the phrase collateral damage and thought of what families call daughters who don't conform. He walked past me, shoulder brushing mine. "Enjoy your little victory." A victory, no. It was a burial. Of more than one man. Later, at the reception in the church basement, I stood near the punch table, unarmed, except for the ribbons on my chest. Conversations floated around me like fog. No one approached. I might as well have been part of the wall. Again. Then a voice cut through. You were mentioned in the will I turned. It was Mrs. Kavanaugh, my grandfather's secretary of 30 years. Her hair was pinned neatly, pearls at her neck like tiny handcuffs of tradition, but her eyes held warmth. Yes, I said, careful not to sound proud. She nodded slowly. He said your name every day that last week, not out loud to people, just under his breath, as if he was trying to memorize it. My throat tightened. She leaned in. He kept a photo of you in uniform from that article in the Defense Chronicle, tucked it into his desk drawer. I didn't know what to say. All I remembered was that article ran during a time I wasn't speaking to the family, after the Afghanistan op, when things went sideways and I came back altered, leaner, quieter. Some nights, I couldn't even hear my own voice over the noise in my skull. She stepped back. Don't think the silence means he didn't see you. He just didn't know how to undo his own pride. And just like that, something broke and healed at once. I walked to the edge of the room, past the casseroles and polite chatter, and slipped out the side door. Outside, the cemetery stretched long and silent, rows of stones like soldiers standing watch. I walked back to his grave, now covered in roses. The air was still, unmoving. I knelt, resting the flag gently beside the headstone, not to leave it, just to breathe. You never said my name when you were alive, I whispered, but now the whole room remembers it. A breeze moved through then, almost like acknowledgement, or maybe I imagined it. You learn to read silence when you've lived inside it long enough. You ever kneel at the grave of someone who doubted you and feel no hate, no rage, just finality? That was me. I stood again, slow, deliberate. My knees creaked reminders of years in boots. Miles marched, lives carried. I picked up the flag and turned away. At the edge of the grass, a man waited, dressed in black, square shoulders, close-cropped hair. His stance gave him away military. Like me. He approached, stopping a respectful distance away. Major Owens, he said. Yes. He extended a hand. Captain Walker, Defense Command. I was assigned to General Owens in the last month. We spoke often. He spoke of you. I didn't answer, unsure where this was going. He continued. He left another message, not public, personal. He asked that it be delivered only if you attended. He pulled out a folded paper, crisp, sealed. I took it, hesitating only a second, then nodded. He turned and left. Alone again, I stared at the seal. Then I opened it. Ellie, I was wrong. Not about what you could do. I always knew that. I just didn't know how to let go of the version of the world where men led and daughters followed. You shattered that. And I didn't know how to love you without making you small. Forgive me, or don't. But know this the day you walked away. I feared we lost you. The day I saw your name in those briefings. I knew you had already outrun us all. Command suits you. It's who you were always meant to be. Major Owens. My pride. I folded the letter with slow, reverent care. My hands were steady now. I walked back to the car, past the guests still sipping punch and talking in circles. No one stopped me, but I felt their eyes soft now, unsure. I placed the letter in my breast pocket, close to the heart. And when I drove off, I didn't look back. The roads were wet from a light afternoon drizzle, the kind that makes every traffic light shimmer like it's part of a different world. My wipers moved in a rhythmic hush, clearing the windshield just enough to keep me focused, but my thoughts weren't on the road. They were back there in the silence of that church, in the echo of my grandfather's voice read aloud by a stranger, and in the letter now folded like a secret inside my jacket. I don't know if you've ever had to rewrite your family story on your own terms, if you've ever had to take all the pages they tore out, the birthdays missed, the calls never returned, the laughter that stopped when you walked in, and stitched them back together with nothing but your own spine. But that's what I was doing as I drove. Line by line, memory by memory. I stopped at a red light near the intersection that used to lead to our old house. I hadn't been down that street in years. But my hands turned the wheel anyway, out of some gravitational pull, some unfinished sentence needing punctuation. The house hadn't changed much. Same brick siding, same overgrown azalea bush that Dad always threatened to cut back but never did. I parked a few houses down, just to look, just to feel. The porch light was on, even though it was still broad daylight. A signal, a mistake. Or maybe they always left it on now for someone who never came home. I stepped out, walked slowly toward the front. I wasn't planning to knock. I didn't even know why I was there. Closure. Maybe. But closure is a lie we tell ourselves to avoid admitting that some wounds just don't heal, they harden. As I neared the porch, I heard voices inside, familiar ones. She thinks she's somebody now. My cousin's voice said, bitter and sharp. She always thought that. My mother replied, quieter but no less cutting. That uniform doesn't erase the way she left this family. And then Mark. My brother Dad would have been disgusted. He's just not here to stop her. I stopped breathing. You know that moment when the truth lands so loud in your chest, you feel it instead of hear it. I stepped back. Slowly. Carefully, as if they could hear my pulse on the steps, as if my existence might rattle their safe little narratives. I returned to my car without a sound, but inside, everything had changed. They didn't know about the letter, or maybe they did and chose not to believe it. They didn't know the real reason I joined the army, or maybe they never cared to ask. When I was 18, I sat in the back row at my father's retirement party. He was finishing 27 years as a civilian defense analyst. Everyone clapped when he spoke. Everyone laughed when he said, "At least my son will carry the family name forward in Washington." I was there, in a dress I didn't want to wear, with a forced smile and a heart that had already enlisted. That night, I applied to West Point. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't need their permission. And when I was accepted, I still remember the exact silence on the other end of the phone when I told my mother. There was no congratulations. No, we're proud of you. Just, are you sure this is what you want? As if duty were a phase, as if my ambition were a tantrum. But I went, and I endured. I learned how to lead when no one listens, how to speak with authority when your voice is the only female one in the room, how to command respect, not demand it. And when I deployed, I sent postcards home. They never replied. I turned on the ignition and sat there for a long while, staring down that familiar street. Then I reached for my phone. Not to call, just to scroll, to remind myself who I'd become without them. I opened the encrypted app used only by my team. Intel briefings, operations, field work. A world they couldn't touch. There was a new message flagged in red. Re-conference, NATO, OSINT request. I opened it. It was from Colonel Price, Major Owens. Are you available to brief the NATO delegation next month on cross-border intel coordination? SecDef specifically requested your insight. Your work in the Ramiar region is considered exemplary. Let me know availability. My fingers paused above the screen. SecDef, the Secretary of Defense, and they said I was a disgrace to the family. You know what's funny? They think shame is stronger than proof. That tradition can erase a track record. That whispered insults carry more weight than formal citations. But they don't know the feeling of standing behind a one-way mirror, watching your analysis prevent the deaths of 100 soldiers. They don't know what it means to be the reason a hostage is returned alive. They only know stories that end in wedding announcements and baby photos. I typed back one word, confirmed, and hit send. The next day, I flew back to the base. My unit was mid-cycle. Morale was low. We'd lost one last month not in combat, but to silence. That kind of loss always hits different. No medals, no trumpet, just absence. I gathered the team in the ready room. The walls were gray, the coffee burned. But these were my people, my real family. I know we're tired, I said, but our next phase isn't just intel, it's impact. They're listening now. High up, what we build here echoes far. One of the new analysts, barely 24, looked up from her laptop and said, "Ma'am, I saw the footage from the funeral. That was you, wasn't it?" I nodded. She smiled. My mom served. Left because no one took her seriously. She saw that clip and said, "Maybe the tide's finally turning." And in that moment, it wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about standing exactly where I was meant to be. I returned to my quarters late that night, changed out of uniform, stared at myself in the mirror. No medals, no bars, just me. You ever look at yourself and realize not one part of your life was handed to you? It's humbling, and it's holy. I opened a drawer and took out my grandfather's letter again, reread it in the quiet. He said he was wrong, and he was. But not just about me. He was wrong about what family means. It's not who shares your blood. It's who would bleed for you. 2 weeks later, I stood in a marble rotunda under the Defense Department's seal, waiting. The air was cold, recycled, clinical but polished like the inside of a machine that never breaks. It was early, and I was the first to arrive. I always am. Years in intelligence teach you one thing above all else. Control isn't about speaking louder. It's about knowing more and showing less. The NATO delegation hadn't arrived yet, but I could already feel the shift. Assistants brushing past in tailored suits, jargon-heavy whispers echoing under the dome, the polished weight of strategy and optics. And beneath it all, I stood a woman once laughed at in her own grandfather's church, now preparing to brief the men who moved troops with a sentence. You ever feel the quiet thrill of walking into a room they thought you'd never enter? It's not adrenaline. It's not pride. It's justice. Quiet justice. Behind me. Footsteps approached, deliberate, low, expensive. I turned. Secretary Dalton. Civilian suit. Black-rimmed glasses. The type of man who looks like he hasn't blinked since the Cold War. "Major Owens," he said. "Walk with me." I followed. We passed security partitions and classified corridors until we reached the strategy briefing room, small, soundproofed, ringed with 3 layers of biometric locks. Inside, a half-moon table, 10 chairs, a single large screen, 1 empty seat at the head. He gestured toward it. "You're sitting there." I blinked. "Sir, the seat. It's yours." I hesitated. "Isn't that for the one with the answers?" He smiled faintly. "And today, that's you." I sat. He leaned on the table, arms crossed. "You do know this briefing has eyes on it, eyes you can't see." I assumed. He nodded. "Then let me say this plainly. You're not here because you're a woman, or because of who your grandfather was. You're here because every time we had a blind spot in the Ramiar region, you found light." I stayed silent. "I've read your files." He continued. "Your decisions saved more than one allied unit. We needed eyes in the dust. You gave us vision." I finally spoke. "Then let's get to work." He left me alone. And for a moment, I sat there in the silence of authority not borrowed, not granted, earned. An hour later, the room filled. French, German, Polish liaisons, uniforms and translators. One or two raised eyebrows when they saw who was leading, but no one objected, because respect doesn't ask. It arrives. I opened the briefing with a map, zoomed to the northern corridor where logistics and chaos collided daily. I spoke not like someone reading bullet points, but like someone who had walked those roads, who had crouched in silence behind concrete blocks and listened to the radio hiss as boys in another language begged for extraction. They listened. When I finished, the French commander spoke first. "You speak as if you've seen it." "I have," I said. And that was enough. The meeting went long, but when it ended, hands were shaken, cards exchanged. A new initiative was approved on the spot. And as the room emptied, one liaison stayed behind. A woman's sharp suit, silver-streaked hair, Danish insignia. "You are Owens?" she asked. "Yes." She smiled. "I've seen your reports. But today, I saw you." She reached out her hand. "Major," she said, "the world is starting to notice." That night, I didn't return to my quarters on base. I checked into a small hotel instead, one of those quiet ones near the Potomac, where the city feels less like politics and more like memory. I sat on the balcony with a glass of water, watching the lights of the Pentagon blink like code through the trees. And I thought of the day I left home. I was 19, one duffel bag, no send-off. I remember my mother standing in the doorway with her arms folded. "You'll regret this," she said. But I never did. I regretted staying silent. I regretted hoping they'd change. I regretted being surprised each time they didn't. But leaving no, that was survival. You know that kind of grief, the one that's not about death, but about realizing some people are never going to be who you needed them to be. That's the grief I carry. Not for what was, but for what never would be. I reached into my bag and pulled out the letter again. My grandfather's words. His final confession. He said I was his pride, and yet, he never said it when it would have changed something, only when it was too late. That's the difference between honor and history. One arrives in time. The other is carved on stone. The next morning, my flight left at 0600. I boarded early, stowed my gear, and took the window seat. As the plane lifted, I watched the city fade beneath the clouds, and I wondered, did they even know I was gone again? Back at base, things moved quickly. Promotion cycles, deployment rotations, another op in the works, still classified. My name was on the short list to lead. Then, out of nowhere, a message came from a name I hadn't seen in years. From Mark. Owens. Subject: Mom's health. I opened it. "Ellie. She's not well. Heart. Nothing immediate. But the doctor's worried. I'm not asking you for anything. Just thought you'd want to know." "No. Hi. No hope you're doing well. Just a string of obligations posing as concern." I didn't reply. Instead, I booked a one-way ticket. When I arrived, no one met me at the airport. No one offered a ride. I rented a car, drove straight to the hospital. At the reception desk, I said her name. The nurse looked up. "You're the daughter." "Right. Yes. She's been asking for you." I blinked. What she said, and I quote, "Tell her I forgive her for missing the funeral." I almost laughed. Forgive me. I entered the room. She was thinner, paler, but still my mother's stern mouth. Unblinking eyes. She looked at me without surprise. "You came," she said. "I did." A long pause. "I suppose you want me to say I'm sorry?" she said. "I don't," I replied. Her lips twitched. Still stubborn. I didn't respond. She studied me. "They talk about you on the news. Your work. I know. You wear it like armor." I looked her straight in the eye. "No," I said. "I wear it like truth." She blinked. once, then looked away. I thought we were protecting you, she murmured. No, you were protecting yourselves. From what I was becoming. She didn't deny it. I stood. The silence between us was final. As I reached the door, she called out, Eleanor. I turned. Are you happy? You ever hear that question from someone who never gave you a reason to be? I paused, then smiled. Not cruel, not triumphant. Just still. I'm free. The hallway outside my mother's hospital room was pale and empty, like it had forgotten color ever existed. I walked slowly, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to stretch the silence, to let it settle, let it prove itself real. That word echoed in my head free. It wasn't said to hurt her. It wasn't said to reclaim anything. It was just the truth, uttered in a way she couldn't deny. For the first time in my life, I didn't leave a conversation needing something from her. Not love, not acknowledgement, not even anger. That hunger the kind daughters carry for decades had been burned away in the fire of becoming someone else. Back in the car, I sat still with both hands on the steering wheel, engine off, sunlight flickering across the dashboard like Morse code. Somewhere in that hospital, my mother was lying under a white sheet, surrounded by blinking machines, and yet I felt more alive than I had in years. You ever step out of someone's expectations like you're taking off a too tight coat? I pulled out my phone. No messages, no missed calls. I wasn't surprised. I wasn't disappointed. Instead, I opened my notes app. I had work to do. I began sketching a mission brief for the upcoming op, the one they'd quietly asked me to lead. Surveillance near the border, coordination with NATO intel, high civilian risk, a tangle of policy and pressure. The kind of task they didn't hand to someone unsure of herself. A few minutes into writing, I paused. A strange feeling settled in my chest. Not grief, not guilt, permission to move forward. Without apology, 2 hours later, I was back at the airport. I didn't stop by the house, didn't text Mark. There was nothing left to say. My presence had never been for them. It was for me to prove that I could walk into that past and leave untouched. Back on base, the sky had darkened. Thunder cracked in the distance, a low pulse rolling across the hills. I returned to my quarters, dropped my bag, and stared at the mirror. I wasn't wearing the uniform, just a black t-shirt, fatigue pants, and a rubber watch band, but I still saw her Major Owens, not because of what was on my chest, but because of what had settled in my spine. There's a moment after every storm, when the clouds begin to break but the wind still carries tension. That's where I was now between aftermath and ascent. That night, a message came from Colonel Price. Operation Redeployment confirmed. You will serve as on-ground lead. Transfer protocol in place. Gear manifests to follow. Report in Oro 400 for full briefing. I stared at the screen for a long time. This was it. The moment that would rewrite the second half of my service. The kind of mission they give to someone they trust with lives, politics, and headlines someone who walks through fire and doesn't blink. I typed 2 words. Understood. Sir. Then I set the phone down, took a deep breath, and finally, I allowed myself to lie back. You know, that rare kind of exhaustion, the kind that doesn't come from running, but from resisting. From carrying the weight of invisibility for so long that your muscles forget what rest feels like. That's the sleep I fell into. Dreamless. Quiet. At 03:50, I was up, dressed, laced, ready. The base was quiet in the pre-dawn dark. Lights flickered on inside command like fireflies on a grid. I walked with a black duffel slung across my shoulder, boots echoing off concrete like drum beats to war. A security guard saluted. I nodded once, sharply. Inside the briefing room, The operation was already projected across 3 massive screens: intel overlays, field agent rosters, terrain schematics. But every person in the room turned as I entered and stood, not out of ceremony, but out of recognition. Because when you've proven yourself without needing to raise your voice, people rise for you without being asked. Colonel Price approached. "Major," he said. "All yours." I walked to the front, took the tablet, clicked to the next slide. The mission was risky. We all knew it. But the room wasn't filled with hesitation, only focus. After the briefing, Price lingered. "You good?" "Yes, sir." He hesitated, then added, "You're not what they expected when this op came up." "I never am." He smiled. "Just barely. That's why it's yours." As I left the room, something inside me shifted again. Not a dramatic burst, just a subtle, permanent alignment. I wasn't stepping into someone else's plan anymore. I was writing the playbook now. 2 days later, we deployed. Helicopters at dawn, dust in our throats. Terrain that felt like it had swallowed centuries of war and still wasn't done chewing. I took point, led from the front, eyes scanning, hand signaling, and they followed. Not because I demanded it, but because the gravity of lived authority pulls men into orbit. There's no substitute for that. At base camp, I reviewed SAT footage alone, headphones in, while the younger officers recapped the day behind me. I could hear them talking, not about me, but about the data, the patterns, the mission, and that, more than anything, was proof of victory. They didn't talk about my gender. They didn't whisper about my name. They trusted the silence I carried. The kind earned in briefing rooms and bone-deep betrayals, the kind shaped not by war, but by what comes after. One night, as we sat around the comms tent sipping thick, bitter coffee, one of the newer soldiers, a 22-year-old with a scar under his left eye and too much grief in his shoulders, asked quietly, "Ma'am, how do you do it? Do what stay this calm, this quiet, like nothing gets to you?" I met his eyes. "It's not that nothing gets to me," I said. "It's that I've already heard worse from people who were supposed to love me." He blinked and nodded, because he understood. Some of the worst battles happen around dinner tables. Some of the deepest wounds are inflicted with polite words and quiet exclusions. And sometimes, the uniform isn't a shield, it's a scar stitched into fabric. That night, I wrote something in my field journal, a line I hadn't been brave enough to admit before. They didn't fail me. They freed me. And in that freedom, I rose, higher than their expectations, louder than their silence, and stronger than their names. The mission ended at 0400 on a Thursday morning. No explosions, no breaking news, just a clean extraction. 3 confirmed objectives, and 1 decrypted hard drive that would shift policy in ways the public might never see. We returned to base with sand still in our boots, sleep deprivation like static behind our eyes, and the kind of deep, reverberating silence only soldiers understand, not because we're speechless, but because some things can't be said, only carried. I turned in my after-action report by 0630. Clean, precise, no heroics, just facts. I always let the work speak louder than the mythology. That's the only way a woman survives in a room of men who still flinch when excellence comes from the wrong mouth. At 0700, Colonel Price stopped me in the hall. "They read the report," he said. "Good. They want you in DC. Next week. Closed-door strategy briefing. And they said..." He paused. "They said you should wear your ribbons." I raised one eyebrow. "So they can use me as a talking point so they can't ignore you anymore." We stood there a moment. The buzz of fluorescent lights above us, the soft clatter of boots on tile in the distance. I could feel the shift again. Not applause, not validation, just stillness. Like standing in a room that once shook beneath judgment, now finally quiet. You ever feel that? That moment when they stop trying to explain you and just start listening? I nodded. I'll be there. He gave a small smile. They're lucky. No, sir, I said. They're late. That afternoon. I packed slowly, not because I was hesitant, but because I wanted to remember the weight of each item: the regulation blazer, the polished boots, the dog tags worn smooth from years against my chest. I paused when I got to the framed letter, the one from my grandfather. I hadn't reread it since the last mission. I didn't need to. It had already been absorbed. Like a wound that scars over, not because it's forgotten, but because the body says, "This is mine now." I tucked it back into its sleeve and closed the case. The flight to Washington was uneventful. Rain tapped against the window the whole way. It was the kind of rain that always made me think of childhood, of gutters overflowing and standing barefoot on a soaked porch, listening to adults argue behind closed doors. But I wasn't that girl anymore. I hadn't been for years. The army didn't erase her. She'd been rebuilt by choice, not by accident. When I arrived at the Capitol complex, an aide escorted me into a long corridor with no windows, high-gloss floor, echoing footsteps. My heels clicked with authority, not caution. In the waiting room, there were already 4 men in suits, 2 generals, 1 senator, and 1 gray-haired consultant who looked like he hadn't changed his tie since the Bush administration. They glanced up when I entered. 1 nodded. The others didn't. I sat. Still, composed. You can tell a lot about power by who speaks first. No one did. Eventually, a door opened. Major Owens I stood, and every eye followed me as I walked past. Inside, a table shaped like a horseshoe. 12 chairs, 10 occupied, 1 empty. At the center, the woman who greeted me, Deputy Director Lang, gestured to the seat. This one's yours. I sat. What followed was 2 hours of debrief, projection analysis, and discussion of intelligence protocol. I answered questions. I presented my team's findings. And I didn't flinch when a senator asked how someone so young had risen this fast. Performance over perception? Sir, I said evenly, and results over reassurance. He shut up after that. At the end, the director of strategic ops leaned forward. You know, he said slowly, we've had our share of showmen in this role. I didn't respond. But you're not here for attention, are you? No, I said. I'm here to get the job done. He tapped his pen, then nodded once. We'll be in touch. Back outside. The sun was beginning to set. I walked past monuments and marble like a ghost retracing her own footsteps. It was surreal to be respected in buildings built by people who would have erased me a generation ago. You ever walk through a world that used to reject you and realize it no longer can? That evening, I found myself near the Arlington boundary wall. I wasn't planning to go, but something pulled me there. Maybe it was ritual. Maybe it was something deeper. I walked in silence past rows of stones equal in size, unequal in memory. And eventually, I found his General Thomas Owens. I stood there, not as a granddaughter this time, but as the woman he tried to forget and could not. I reached into my coat pocket and removed a small brass insignia, the first bar I ever earned, bent at the corner, faded. I placed it on the grass and whispered, "You were wrong, but you were right to name me. No thunder, no tears, just peace." As I turned to leave, a voice called out behind me, "Ellie." I froze. I hadn't heard that name in years, not from anyone who said it gently. I turned. Mark. He looked thinner, a little older. He held a bouquet of crumpled flowers, as if they had been an afterthought. He stood awkwardly, like someone trying to step back into a room they'd locked from the inside. "I didn't know you were here," he said. "I didn't tell anyone." He shifted. "Mom, she's not doing great." "I know." Silence. Heavy. Clumsy. "I read about your mission," he added. "Which one?" "The big one. The one that made the NATO wire." I said nothing. He cleared his throat. "Dad would have—" He trailed off, then corrected himself. "Granddad would have been proud," he told me himself. His eyes widened slightly. "He did." I nodded. A long pause. Then he said, "You made it." "No," I replied. "I built it." He swallowed hard. "I guess I just didn't know how to deal with it." "That's your problem, Mark, not mine." He didn't argue. I walked past him, slow and measured. When I reached the gate, I heard him say, "You coming home again?" I stopped. You ever hear that word home and realize it's just geography? I turned my head slightly. I already am. Then I walked into the dark. 2 days later, I stood in front of a mirror in a room where everything smelled like paper and power. The briefing was over. The commendation awarded. They handed me the plaque with sterile smiles and a firm handshake as if recognition could be calculated, dispensed, and filed away before lunch. But I didn't need their applause. I never had. I walked out of that building, back into the wind of the capital city, with my uniform still sharp and my name echoing behind me in quiet corridors. Not whispered, not questioned, just known. At the corner near the National Mall, a school group passed. 4th or 5th graders, judging by the 2 big backpacks and the sound of a teacher trying to keep order. One boy glanced up at me, then at the bars on my shoulder, then whispered something to the girl next to him. I didn't hear the words, but I saw the awe in their faces. And for once, I didn't shrink. You ever feel your body expand not physically, but like your presence finally fits the space it was always meant to fill? That's what it felt like, back on base. The days blurred into briefings and recon cycles. My name was now casually dropped into conversations where it used to be avoided. People who once overlooked me now asked for my opinion. Not because I'd grown louder, but because I no longer made myself smaller. That's the part they never tell you about power. It's not in how you speak. It's in what you stop apologizing for. The next op came faster than expected. A flash directive, remote surveillance support, offshore extraction, high clearance. They handed it to me without hesitation. 3 weeks later, we landed on foreign soil under silent orders and untraceable comms. I led my team through fog and shadows, into a compound so quiet it felt abandoned by time. The mission was clean, until it wasn't. A local intel leak forced us to pivot. And in the space of 20 minutes, I had to make 3 decisions that would determine if we all walked out or none of us did. I made the call, held my voice steady, pulled rank when I had to, and when we were finally airborne again, with every body accounted for and the package secured, I sat back in my seat and felt nothing, not relief, not pride, just stillness. You know that kind of calm, the one that comes after chaos. Not because it's over, but because you've trained your soul to breathe through fire. That's the calm I carried home. When we returned, the debrief was short. They trusted my report. They always do now. But there was something waiting for me that I didn't expect. A letter, paper, real. Not from command, not from NATO, not from the department. From my mother. I stared at the envelope for 2 full minutes before opening it. The handwriting was familiar, controlled. Blue ink on cream paper. Eleanor, I don't know if this letter will reach you at the right time. I'm not even sure I deserve to be writing it. But I have to say something before time takes the chance from me completely. I watched the ceremony, the one with the secretary. I saw your name. I saw your face. And I realized something I should have known years ago. You didn't break away from this family. We pushed you out with our silences, with our judgments, with our smallness. And you didn't disappear. You became someone so big the world had to see you. I don't expect forgiveness. I know that word has been used like a trap too many times. But I want you to know I see you now. Not as a soldier. Not even as a major. As a daughter. My daughter. If nothing else, please keep this letter. Let it be the one thing I gave you willingly. Mom, I sat on my cot and read it 3 times. Not because I didn't believe it, but because part of me had stopped needing it. That was the strangest part. The healing didn't come from her words. It came from the fact that I no longer hinged my worth on them. Her letter wasn't a rescue. It was a relic. And still I folded it gently, slid it into the side pocket of my duffel. Not as a wound, not as proof, as peace. That weekend, I was called to attend a private event, a roundtable for rising command officers, civilian guests included. It was the kind of function where medals weren't worn, but reputations shimmered across the room like invisible ink. I arrived early, stood near the far wall, glass of water in my hand. A few officers nodded at me from across the space. 2 new recruits, both female, smiled when they saw me. I nodded back. That was enough. Then I heard it. Her voice. Eleanor. I turned. It was Aunt Lila. Pearls. Pressed blazer. Same thin smile, but a different light in her eyes. Not contempt. Not even surprise. Something closer to caution. I didn't know you'd be here, she said. Neither did I replied. She hesitated. I saw the footage. From NATO. The commendation. You've done well. Done well. As if I'd passed a test I was never meant to take. But I didn't flinch. I didn't do it for applause. No. I suppose not. She fidgeted with her purse strap. Your mother said she wrote to you. She did. And she said what she needed to say. Lila nodded. Then looked down. For the first time in her life. I think she didn't know where to place me. I wasn't the rebel. I wasn't the disappointment. I wasn't even the overachiever anymore. I was something they had no script for. A woman who no longer sought their approval and yet stood tall enough to eclipse it. When she left, I turned back toward the window, letting the hum of conversation blur into background. I wasn't there to be seen. I was there because I had become someone no one could unsee. You ever reach that point where the story they tried to write for you finally collapses under the weight of your reality? That night, I walked back to my quarters under a sky filled with stars. Not military precision, just nature, raw and wide. I stood there for a while, breathing in air that didn't belong to any rank, any uniform, any name, just breath, just presence. And I whispered to the dark not for them, not for forgiveness, but for every version of me that ever waited to be allowed in. You're home now, 3 months later. I stood once again in front of a casket, but this time, there were no whispers, no laughter, no dismissive glances at my uniform. This time, the silence carried weight. It didn't isolate me. It surrounded me, protected me. Like rank finally does, once it's earned beyond question. It was my mother's funeral. No drama, no spectacle, just a white cloth over a simple coffin, a small gathering of family smaller than I expected, and a chaplain who struggled to find the right tone. I didn't cry. I didn't need to. We had already had our final conversation, written not in words, but in recognition. I wore the same uniform I had at my grandfather's burial, though now there were 2 new ribbons on the chest. No one mocked them. No one dared. Mark stood across the aisle. He looked at me, nodded once, and said nothing. That, in our language, meant respect. After the ceremony, people gathered by the graveside. Some spoke, some didn't. A few shared stories. I stayed quiet. I didn't need the podium. My presence was speech enough. As the last of the soil was packed, I stepped forward alone. I took one slow breath and removed a folded letter from my pocket, the same one she had sent months ago. I placed it on the lid of the coffin before the earth swallowed it. Not as forgiveness, as closure. You ever give someone back their words not in anger, but as a full circle? That was the moment. Back at the reception, they served black coffee and dry cake. I stayed 15 minutes, long enough to be seen, short enough not to be used as a prop. Aunt Lila approached, again in pearls, again looking like she had prepared a sentence and lost it halfway. "I didn't know she had written you," she said softly. "She did." I think she wanted to say it in person. "She couldn't," I replied, but I could still hear her. Lila gave a brittle smile. "She spoke about you often." At the end, I tilted my head. Did she ever apologize out loud? Her lips tightened. Not in so many words. Then it was enough. I walked away before she could twist it into something else. Outside, the wind pulled at the corners of my uniform, but I stood still. I looked out at the trees, the sunlight speckling through them, and realized something I hadn't understood until now. This was no longer about them, not about what they did, or didn't do, or said behind closed doors. Not about the titles they refused to give, or the spaces they kept me from entering. It wasn't about being seen anymore. It was about seeing myself with clarity so sharp it could slice through every old wound. I turned and walked toward my car, alone but not lonely. The silence now was mine, not theirs. A silence of power, of knowing. Back on base, I returned to duty without ceremony. I resumed command of my team, briefed the next phase of field intelligence, and scheduled flight ops for the following quarter. The work never slows, but that's how I like it, forward momentum without apology. A few days later, Colonel Price called me into his office. "Close the door," he said. I did. He looked up from his desk and slid a thin manila folder toward me. Your name came up, twice. Once in a Black Ops directive, once at a DC committee review. I waited. He sat back. They want you to take a senior command role, not just field. Strategic. High-level policy influence. Intel, and deployment. I didn't flinch. And the catch. He smiled. They'll try to dress it up like politics. You'll be sent to meetings, speeches, handshakes, but beneath all that, it's command. Quiet. Permanent. Real. I nodded. And you think I should accept? I think, he said carefully, that the war you fought to be seen is over. Now comes the one where they can't look away. I signed the papers that afternoon. 2 weeks later, I stood in a polished steel room, staring out at a classified map of our next strategic expansion zone. Dotted lines, code names, access layers I used to dream of even glimpsing. And now, I was drawing the boundaries myself. A young officer entered the room, nervous. Probably his first week on base. "Ma'am, sorry to interrupt," he said. "Your transport's ready." I turned. "Which transport to the leadership summit?" They said you're presenting first keynote. I almost smiled. It wasn't pride. It wasn't satisfaction. It was recognition, not from them, but from the part of myself that remembered every door they told me I'd never open. I walked down the hallway with even steps, my boots silent against the polished floor. When I passed the entry gate, 2 junior officers straightened. One saluted. Major Owens. I returned the gesture, calm and steady, But just before I boarded the car, one of them called out, "Ma'am, can I ask something?" I turned slightly. "What do you do when people don't believe you belong?" I didn't answer right away. Then I said, "You become so excellent that they regret ever questioning it." He nodded, eyes wide, and I knew he'd remember that. I arrived at the summit as the sun began to rise. Inside the chamber, the audience buzzed with quiet energy. Generals, advisors, civilian strategists, international reps. They called my name. I walked to the stage, took my place behind the podium, and before I spoke, I looked out not to see who was watching, but to feel it. The room stilled. I began, not with numbers, not with projections, but with a truth they didn't expect. When I joined, I said, I was told my voice would never fill a room like this, that I should speak softer, stay humble, wait my turn. I paused. My voice didn't get louder. The room got quieter. And in that silence, the one they once used to erase me, I stood surrounded by the very people who now needed to listen. After the speech, a dozen hands reached out. None of them carried mockery, only respect. But the moment I'll remember wasn't on stage. It was in the back hallway, where an older woman approached me. Civilian clothes, soft eyes. "My daughter's applying to the academy," she said. "I used to be afraid for her, and now I tell her to look you up." I nodded. "Tell her to outrank me." She laughed, hand over her heart. Then she whispered, "She already calls you Commander Owens." I smiled, and I realized this was the legacy. Not medals, not eulogies, but becoming undeniable. That evening, I returned to my quarters, alone, at peace, no one waiting, no one absent. I removed my jacket, hung it on the wall, and looked at the nameplate, Major Eleanor Owens. Then I turned to the empty room, quiet and steady, and said the words that had waited years to be true. I didn't need them to respect me. The whole room already did.